August 1st, 1943. The morning air hung thick with aviation fuel and desert heat over Benghazi Air Base in Libya. At 0400 hours, the pre-dawn darkness vibrated with the thunder of 178 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines warming to life across the tarmac. Inside the cockpit of B-24 Liberator serial number 4240994, nicknamed the Witch's Brew, Second Lieutenant Jack Anderson adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his instruments one final time. The altimeter read 0. The fuel gauges showed full. The radio crackled with static and nervous chatter from 93 other Liberator crews preparing for what military historians would later call the longest and most audacious bombing mission of the European theater. The target lay 2,000 miles to the north, the oil refineries of Ploiești, Romania. The mission designation was Operation Tidal Wave. The odds of survival, according to intelligence estimates, were roughly 50%. Anderson wiped condensation from his bomb sight with an oil-stained rag and thought about something his crew chief had told him 3 weeks earlier at the Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, where this very aircraft had rolled off the assembly line. "Lieutenant," the grizzled foreman had said, pointing to the river of aluminum bombers flowing past them at the rate of one every 63 minutes. "We're building these birds faster than Jerry can shoot 'em down. That's your edge up there." The desert wind carried the scent of cordite from the armaments depot where 2,500-pound bombs waited in neat rows, each one stamped with inspection codes from plants in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. The morning light revealed the massive scale of what American industry had accomplished in just 18 months since Pearl Harbor. Row upon row of 4-engine bombers stretched across the Libyan sand, each one representing roughly 63,000 individual parts manufactured in over 700 factories across the continental United States, assembled by workers who had never seen combat, but understood with crystalline clarity that every rivet, every bolt, every precisely machined component carried the weight of civilization itself. The aircrew briefing had been stark and methodical. Colonel Keith Compton, mission commander, had stood before a map of southeastern Europe marked with red circles and black arrows. Intelligence photographs showed the Romanian countryside dotted with anti-aircraft gun emplacements, searchlight batteries, and Luftwaffe fighter strips. The Ploiești oil complex produced nearly 1/3 of Germany's petroleum products. Destroying it would cripple the Wehrmacht's ability to fuel its tanks, trucks, and aircraft across 3 theaters of war. The mission profile called for low-level attack runs at 200 feet altitude to avoid radar detection and maximize bombing accuracy. What the briefing did not mention, what every man in that tent understood without words, was that flying 200 feet above heavily defended targets was essentially a suicide mission dressed up in military terminology. Anderson's navigator, Lieutenant Bobby Chen from San Francisco, spread his charts across the cramped navigation table and began plotting their route north over the Mediterranean. The mathematics were unforgiving. 700 miles to the Yugoslav coast, another 800 miles overland through hostile airspace, 2 hours over target, 700 miles back to friendly territory. 14 hours total flight time with no margin for error, no possibility of rescue if mechanical failure or enemy action forced them down over occupied Europe. The fuel calculations allowed for exactly 37 minutes of combat maneuvering over the target area. After that, physics would take over, and physics favored gravity. The irony was not lost on the American crews that their aircraft represented the most sophisticated mass production achievement in human history, yet they were about to use them in the most primitive form of warfare imaginable, flying directly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire at an altitude where accuracy was guaranteed, but survival was not. Each B-24 Liberator had cost the American taxpayer approximately $200,000 in 1943 currency. The bombs they carried represented another $50,000 in high explosives and precision manufacturing. The crews themselves represented millions of dollars in training, from basic flight instruction through advanced navigation, gunnery, and bombardier schools. All of this industrial and human investment was about to be hazarded on a single roll of the dice 2,000 miles from home. At precisely 0700 hours, the first Liberator lifted off from the desert runway, followed by another every 60 seconds until the entire strike force was airborne and forming up over the Mediterranean. From the ground, the sight was both magnificent and terrible. Nearly 104 engine bombers climbing into formation, their contrails drawing geometric patterns across the morning sky. Each aircraft carried a crew of 10 men and represented the culmination of American industrial might. But in the minds of German intelligence officers monitoring radio traffic from listening posts across occupied Europe, these bombers represented something far more ominous, proof that America had solved the fundamental equation of modern warfare. While the Ploiești strike force climbed toward their cruising altitude of 15,000 feet, 3,000 miles away in Michigan, the Ford Willow Run plant was beginning another 8-hour shift. The factory floor stretched for over 1 mile under a single roof, with assembly lines moving at precisely calculated speeds to optimize production efficiency. Every 63 minutes, another B-24 Liberator rolled out the main doors, complete and ready for combat. The workers, many of them women who had never held industrial jobs before the war, understood that their work was directly connected to the survival of the young men flying their products into combat over Europe and the Pacific. German military analysts had been tracking American aircraft production with growing alarm since early 1942. Intelligence reports filed with the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht painted a disturbing picture of industrial capacity that seemed to defy economic logic. How could a nation maintain civilian consumption, support allied nations through Lend-Lease, and simultaneously outproduce the combined aircraft manufacturing capacity of Germany, Japan, and Italy? The answer lay in fundamental differences in industrial philosophy that German planners had failed to comprehend. In the wardrooms of German air bases, scattered across occupied Romania, Luftwaffe pilots and intelligence officers had developed their own theories about American bomber tactics. They dismissed the industrial statistics as propaganda and focused instead on what they could observe directly: American bomber formations that seemed to prioritize quantity over quality, crews that appeared young and inexperienced compared to veteran Luftwaffe pilots with hundreds of combat hours. The prevailing opinion among German fighter pilots was that American bombers were formidable in numbers, but vulnerable to concentrated attack by experienced pilots flying superior aircraft. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong, but the roots of German overconfidence ran deep. The Luftwaffe had dominated European skies for 4 years, developing tactics and technologies that had swept aside the air forces of Poland, France, Norway, and the Low Countries. German aircraft designers had produced machines like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 that were genuinely superior in many performance categories to their Allied counterparts. German pilots had accumulated combat experience that American crews simply could not match. What German planners failed to understand was that industrial warfare operates by different rules than individual combat. The mathematical reality of American production was staggering in its implications. By August 1943, American aircraft factories were producing more military aircraft each month than Germany had manufactured in the entire year of 1939. The Ford Willow Run plant alone was capable of producing more B-24 Liberators in a single year than the total number of heavy bombers in the entire Luftwaffe inventory. This was not merely a question of industrial capacity. It represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of warfare itself. As the Ploiești strike force crossed the Mediterranean at 15,000 feet, the crews could see the entire expanse of their formation spread across the sky. 93 bombers flying in tight defensive boxes, each one bristling with 1350 caliber machine guns operated by gunners trained to engage targets at ranges up to 800 yards. The defensive firepower of the entire formation represented over 1,200 machine guns, capable of delivering concentrated fire that could shred attacking fighters. Yet every crew member understood that their primary defense lay not in their guns, but in their numbers, and in the knowledge that for every bomber lost over enemy territory, American factories would replace it with 3 more within the week. The psychology of industrial warfare was beginning to manifest itself in ways that traditional military thinking had not anticipated. German fighter pilots approaching American bomber formations were no longer engaging individual aircraft operated by specific crews. They were attacking a manifestation of American industrial capacity that seemed to regenerate faster than it could be destroyed. Every Luftwaffe pilot who had survived encounters with American bomber formations reported the same unsettling observation. Shooting down American bombers felt less like tactical victories and more like attempts to drain the ocean with a bucket. At 10:30 hours, the Ploiești strike force reached the Yugoslav coast and began its descent toward the deck. The mission profile called for a treetop-level approach to avoid radar detection, which meant flying at altitudes where mechanical failure or pilot error would prove instantly fatal. The bombers descended from 15,000 feet to 200 feet in a matter of minutes, transforming from high-altitude strategic bombers into low-level attack aircraft operating at the very limits of aerodynamic safety. The psychological impact on the crews was immediate and profound. At 15,000 feet, the earth below appeared abstract and distant. At 200 feet, every tree, every building, every anti-aircraft gun position was visible in terrifying detail. The Romanian countryside flashed beneath the bomber formation at 260 miles per hour. Church spires passed between the wings. Farmers working in fields looked up in amazement as 93 four-engine bombers thundered overhead at an altitude where individual faces were clearly visible. Radio operators monitoring German military frequencies reported increasing activity as Luftwaffe fighter squadrons scrambled from airfields across southeastern Europe. The element of surprise, crucial to mission success, was rapidly evaporating as the massive bomber formation announced its presence to every German radar station and observation post within a 100-mile radius. At precisely 11:47 hours, the first American bomber crossed into Romanian airspace. Within minutes, the sky above Ploiești erupted in a symphony of anti-aircraft fire that crews would later describe as resembling a 4th of July fireworks display viewed from ground level. German 88mm flak guns, the most feared anti-aircraft weapons in the world, began laying down a carpet of exploding steel that turned the air around the refinery complex into a deadly maze of shrapnel and explosive concussion. The accuracy of German anti-aircraft fire at low altitude was devastating. Unlike high-altitude bombing where flak bursts created scattered patterns of shrapnel, low-level attack runs brought bombers directly into the kill zones of weapons designed to destroy aircraft with mathematical precision. Lieutenant Anderson's bomber entered the anti-aircraft fire zone at 11:52 hours. The first 88mm shell exploded 30 feet off his starboard wing, close enough to pepper the fuselage with shrapnel and crack the cockpit glass. The second shell exploded directly beneath the aircraft, lifting the 28-ton bomber like a leaf in a hurricane and sending pieces of aluminum skin peeling away from the wings. The third shell punched a hole through the bomb bay without exploding, creating a perfect circle of daylight where solid metal had existed milliseconds earlier. Through his bomb sight, Anderson could see the primary target, the massive Astra Romana refinery, with its maze of storage tanks, cracking towers, and pipeline networks. Intelligence photographs had not adequately conveyed the sheer scale of the installation. The refinery complex covered over 12 square miles and represented one of the most sophisticated petroleum processing facilities in Europe. Destroying it would require precise placement of high-explosive bombs on critical infrastructure targets identified through months of intelligence analysis and industrial espionage. The bombing run lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. In that brief span of time, American bombers delivered over 1 million pounds of high explosives onto targets that had been selected with scientific precision to maximize disruption of German petroleum production. The secondary explosions began almost immediately as aviation gasoline storage tanks ignited in chain reactions that sent columns of black smoke climbing to 20,000 feet. The heat from burning petroleum was so intense that bomber crews flying through the smoke clouds at 200 feet altitude reported cabin temperatures exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit. But the cost was catastrophic. Of the 93 bombers that had crossed Romanian airspace, 37 were shot down during the attack run or destroyed while attempting to escape German fighter interception. 370 American aircrew members were killed, wounded, or captured. In terms of immediate tactical results, Operation Tidal Wave had achieved its primary objective. The Ploiești refineries were severely damaged, and petroleum production was reduced by approximately 60% for several months. In terms of strategic implications, however, the mission represented something far more significant. German intelligence officers analyzing the wreckage of American bombers shot down over Romania made a disturbing discovery. The serial numbers on the destroyed aircraft indicated that several bombers had been manufactured less than 30 days before the mission. This meant that American industry was not only replacing combat losses, but was accelerating production to levels that defied German understanding of industrial capacity. A captured American aircrew member, when interrogated about aircraft production, provided information that German intelligence initially dismissed as propaganda. The Ford Willow Run plant was producing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. The mathematical implications were staggering. If American claims were accurate, a single factory was producing more heavy bombers each month than the entire German aircraft industry could manufacture. German planners had based their strategic calculations on the assumption that attrition warfare would eventually deplete American aircraft reserves. The revelation that American industry could replace losses faster than German defenses could inflict them represented a fundamental shift in the strategic balance of the war. Romanian civilians who witnessed the Ploiești attack reported seeing American bombers that had been damaged beyond any reasonable expectation of flight continuing to attack their assigned targets. One B-24, with its left wing on fire and 2 engines destroyed, maintained formation long enough to deliver its bomb load before finally crashing into a petroleum storage tank, creating an explosion that was heard 30 miles away. The crew, all 10 members, were killed instantly, but their sacrifice destroyed enough aviation gasoline to fuel an entire Luftwaffe fighter squadron for 3 months. German fighter pilots engaging the escaping American bombers reported encounters that differed fundamentally from their previous experience with Allied aircraft. American gunners, many of them still teenagers, displayed a level of training and coordination that suggested systematic preparation rather than hasty wartime training. The defensive gunnery patterns created by American bomber formations forced German fighters to attack from angles and altitudes that negated their performance advantages. More significantly, German pilots reported that shooting down American bombers felt increasingly futile because new formations appeared with such regularity that individual victories had no measurable impact on overall American offensive capability. The psychological impact on German military leadership was profound and immediate. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, responsible for German aircraft production, filed a report with the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht that painted a stark picture of industrial inadequacy. German aircraft factories, operating at maximum capacity with impressed foreign labor and increasingly scarce raw materials, were producing approximately 800 military aircraft per month. American industry, according to intelligence estimates that Milch now believed to be accurate, was producing over 8,000 military aircraft per month and accelerating toward even higher production levels. At 16:47 hours, the surviving bombers of the Ploiești strike force crossed back into Allied airspace over the Mediterranean. 56 aircraft had escaped Romanian airspace, many of them so heavily damaged that they would never fly again. Lieutenant Anderson's bomber had sustained over 200 shrapnel holes, lost its hydraulic system, and was flying on 2 engines with a 3rd engine consuming oil at an unsustainable rate. His navigator had been wounded by flak fragments, and his tail gunner was unconscious from blood loss. Yet the aircraft continued flying, testament to the engineering principles that had guided its design and construction in Michigan 18 months earlier. The strategic significance of Operation Tidal Wave extended far beyond the immediate damage inflicted on Romanian oil production. German military planners now understood that they were engaged in a form of warfare for which their traditional tactical excellence provided no adequate response. The mathematical reality of American industrial production meant that attrition strategies would inevitably favor the United States. Every German fighter pilot shot down represented irreplaceable loss of training and experience. Every American bomber shot down would be replaced by 3 more within the week, operated by crews whose training was becoming more sophisticated and systematic with each passing month. At the Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, the afternoon shift received news of the Ploiești mission through radio broadcasts that provided only limited details about casualties and mission results. The workers understood that bombers they had built were engaged in combat operations, but the industrial rhythm of the assembly line continued without interruption. Every 63 minutes, another B-24 Liberator rolled out of the factory doors, complete with engines, armament, navigation equipment, and communication systems manufactured in dozens of other plants across the United States. The serial numbers on these aircraft were already assigned to replacement crews training at air bases in Kansas, Arizona, and Texas. The industrial transformation that made Operation Tidal Wave possible had begun in earnest 18 months earlier, when American automobile manufacturers converted their production lines to military aircraft manufacturing. The Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Douglas Aircraft, and dozens of other corporations had embraced mass production techniques that treated military aircraft like consumer products manufactured to precise specifications with interchangeable components. This approach conflicted with traditional aircraft manufacturing philosophy, which emphasized individual craftsmanship and custom fitting, but it produced results that defied conventional wisdom about industrial capacity. German aircraft designers had pursued a different philosophy, focusing on technological superiority and individual aircraft performance, rather than mass production efficiency. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were genuinely superior aircraft in many performance categories, but they required skilled craftsmen and precision manufacturing techniques that limited production volumes. German military planners had calculated that technological superiority would compensate for numerical disadvantage, but the mathematics of industrial warfare operated according to different principles. By September 1943, less than 1 month after the Ploiești mission, American heavy bomber formations over Europe had grown to unprecedented size and frequency. Single missions now involved over 700 bombers attacking multiple targets simultaneously across occupied territory. German fighter pilots reported engagement scenarios that resembled attacking swarms of insects rather than individual aircraft formations. The defensive firepower of American bomber formations had reached levels where German fighter attacks resulted in prohibitive casualties regardless of tactical success. The strategic bombing campaign against German industrial targets accelerated throughout the autumn of 1943, with American bombers appearing over German cities with mechanical regularity that German air defense commanders found impossible to counter effectively. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was devastating, but the impact on German military planners was even more significant. Intelligence reports from captured American aircrew members consistently confirmed production statistics that German analysts had initially dismissed as propaganda. American industry was indeed producing military aircraft at rates that exceeded German comprehension. Lieutenant Jack Anderson returned to combat operations in October 1943, flying a new B-24 Liberator that had been manufactured at the Willow Run plant 6 weeks after his Ploiești mission. The aircraft incorporated design improvements based on combat experience reports filed by crews who had survived previous missions. The defensive armament had been enhanced, the fuel system had been modified to reduce fire hazards, and the navigation equipment had been upgraded with new radar systems that improved bombing accuracy under adverse weather conditions. These improvements were implemented across the entire production line within weeks of being identified, demonstrating an adaptability that German military industry could not match. The human cost of the industrial approach to warfare was measured not only in aircrew casualties, but in the transformation of young Americans from civilian backgrounds into participants in mechanized warfare. Anderson and his crew members had been college students, mechanics, farm boys, and store clerks 18 months earlier. The training programs that converted them into bomber crews represented an industrial approach to military education that paralleled the mass production techniques used to manufacture their aircraft. Standardized curricula, systematic skill development, and coordinated team training produced aircrew members whose competence and coordination improved measurably with each successive class. German military leaders were beginning to understand that they were engaged in conflict with an industrial system rather than a traditional military force. American bombers attacking German targets were not operated by individual pilots making tactical decisions based on personal experience and intuition. They were components of an integrated system that included industrial production, logistics coordination, intelligence analysis, and strategic planning on a scale that exceeded German organizational capacity. The American approach to warfare represented industrialization of violence in ways that traditional military thinking had not anticipated. The autumn bombing campaign of 1943 demonstrated the strategic implications of industrial warfare with devastating clarity. German aircraft production facilities, petroleum refineries, transportation networks, and military manufacturing plants came under sustained attack by bomber formations that seemed to grow larger and more frequent with each passing week. German air defenses, initially effective against smaller formations, proved inadequate against the concentrated firepower and numerical superiority of American bombing operations. The mathematical reality was inescapable. German industry could not simultaneously produce enough fighter aircraft to defend against American bombers and enough offensive aircraft to maintain combat operations on multiple fronts. By December 1943, German intelligence reports painted a picture of American industrial capacity that bordered on the incomprehensible. The Ford Willow Run plant alone was producing more heavy bombers each month than the total German aircraft production across all categories. Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, and other American manufacturers were operating at production levels that represented complete transformation of peacetime industrial capacity into military manufacturing. The combined output of American aircraft factories exceeded the total aircraft production of all Axis nations combined, and production rates were continuing to accelerate. The strategic implications extended beyond aircraft production to encompass the entire industrial infrastructure supporting American military operations. American shipyards were launching more cargo vessels each month than the combined tonnage of the German U-boat fleet could sink. American steel production exceeded German capacity by factors that German metallurgists found difficult to comprehend. American petroleum production provided not only domestic military requirements, but also supplied Allied nations through Lend-Lease programs that kept British and Soviet forces operational across multiple theaters of war. Lieutenant Anderson completed his 25th and final mission in February 1944, having participated in bombing operations against industrial targets across occupied Europe. His survival was statistically remarkable. Bomber crew casualty rates in the European theater exceeded 50% during peak combat operations. Yet his individual survival was less significant than the systematic nature of crew replacement and aircraft production that characterized American bombing operations. Every crew member who completed a combat tour was replaced by new personnel whose training had been refined and improved based on combat experience reports. Every aircraft lost to enemy action was replaced by multiple new bombers incorporating design improvements and performance enhancements. The industrial transformation of American society during World War II represented more than increased production capacity. It demonstrated the application of scientific management principles to military operations on an unprecedented scale. The coordination required to produce, transport, maintain, and operate thousands of military aircraft simultaneously across multiple theaters of war involved logistics planning and resource allocation that exceeded the complexity of any previous industrial undertaking. American military planners had effectively industrialized warfare itself, treating combat operations as manufacturing processes subject to systematic analysis and continuous improvement. German military resistance to American bombing operations continued throughout 1944, but the strategic trajectory of the conflict had become mathematically inevitable. German fighter pilots, many of them veterans with exceptional skill and experience, continued to inflict casualties on American bomber formations. But the rate of American aircraft replacement exceeded German capacity to maintain defensive operations. The fundamental equation of industrial warfare favored the nation with superior production capacity, regardless of individual tactical outcomes. The psychological impact on German military personnel was profound and demoralizing. Luftwaffe pilots reported feeling overwhelmed by the sheer scale of American air operations. Ground crews responsible for maintaining German aircraft struggled with increasingly severe shortages of replacement parts, aviation fuel, and experienced mechanics. German aircraft designers continued to produce technologically advanced fighters and interceptors, but production volumes remained insufficient to alter the strategic balance of air warfare over Europe. The final phase of the European Air War demonstrated the complete triumph of industrial capacity over traditional military virtues. By early 1945, American bomber formations operating over Germany encountered minimal fighter opposition, not because German pilots lacked courage or skill, but because German industry could no longer produce sufficient aircraft or fuel to maintain defensive operations. The mathematical reality of attrition warfare had proven decisive. American industry had achieved what military strategists call industrial supremacy. The ability to produce and deploy military force faster than opponents could counter it. Lieutenant Jack Anderson returned to civilian life in Michigan after completing his combat tour, but he remained connected to the aircraft industry that had produced the bombers he had flown over Europe. The Ford Willow Run plant continued producing B-24 Liberators until the end of the war, ultimately manufacturing 6,792 bombers in less than 3 years of operation. The plant's production statistics represented more than industrial achievement. They demonstrated the successful application of mass production principles to military manufacturing that transformed the fundamental nature of modern warfare. The strategic lessons of World War II air operations extended far beyond immediate military applications. The successful integration of industrial production, scientific research, and military operations established principles of technological warfare that would influence military planning for decades. The mathematical relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness had been demonstrated with historical clarity that could not be disputed or ignored by future military planners. The human dimension of industrial warfare remained the most significant aspect of the American achievement during World War II. The young men who flew American bombers over Europe were products of an educational and training system that emphasized systematic skill development, coordinated teamwork, and technological competence. Their individual courage and sacrifice were essential elements of military success, but their effectiveness derived from integration into industrial and organizational systems that amplified individual capabilities through coordinated effort. The legacy of Operation Tidal Wave and the broader American bombing campaign against Germany represented validation of industrial approaches to military conflict that challenged traditional concepts of warfare based on individual heroism and tactical excellence. The mathematical reality of production capacity had proven more decisive than pilot skill, aircraft performance, or tactical innovation. This lesson would influence military planning and industrial policy throughout the remainder of the 20th century. In the end, the sky belonged to America, not because American pilots were more courageous than their opponents, but because American industry had mastered the fundamental equation of modern warfare. The nation with superior production capacity could ultimately overwhelm any opponent, regardless of individual tactical outcomes. The assembly lines of Michigan had defeated the fighter squadrons of Germany through mathematics rather than heroism, through systematic production rather than individual excellence. This victory represented both the triumph and the tragedy of industrial civilization applied to human conflict. History isn't just written, it's remembered through those who still care to listen. The thunder of engines over Ploiești echoes still in the hearts of those who understand that freedom's greatest weapon was never the bomb or the bullet, but the quiet determination of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. What story should we tell next? Subscribe to keep their memory alive. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps me keep making better content for you.